Hi everybody, I'm Neil Smith, and welcome to my Polar Lights 132 scale Kellogg Shuttlecraft custom build. That's right, I said Kellogg Shuttlecraft, but I'm showing the most recent release of the Galileo Shuttlecraft model by Polar Lights, so what gives? Well, to answer that question, we need to have a little history lesson. But first, I want to note that this build is dedicated to the memory of my dad, Neil Smith Sr. My dad was, among many things, a fan of Studebaker classic cars. In fact, his love of Studebakers was probably just as strong as my love of Star Trek and all things sci-fi, maybe even more so. And he had a model car collection that was truly impressive. It's from him that I obviously got my love for building models. And this build has a very specific Studebaker connection that I think he would have loved. So, history lesson. In 1966, when the producers of the original series of Star Trek needed a design for a new ship, the Shuttlecraft, art director Matt Jefferies did several designs of the craft that were deemed too expensive or too difficult to build. So they turned to the acclaimed design firm of Raymond Loewy Associates with instructions to design a ship that would be easier to construct. Thomas Kellogg was given the job of coming up with the design. Kellogg had worked on the 1962 Studebaker Avanti, so not surprisingly, the Kellogg Shuttlecraft's design had some similarities to that classic car. Kellogg designed a glossy black shuttlecraft that was boxy but with graceful lines. It had a giant glass front end, glowing red engines, and dual antennas. The shuttlecraft that ended up in the series retains the main body of Kellogg's design, but there were some changes that were made prior to construction. The large glass window in the front was replaced with much more practical and closable smaller windows. The color was changed to a neutral gray, and 2 warp nacelles were added to the ship to better match the look of the USS Enterprise. There exists, as far as I know, only this one sketch done by Thomas Kellogg of the proposed shuttlecraft design. Well, that and a cutaway illustration done by the amazingly talented Matt Cushman, master of cutaways. But a physical model was built by Bill George for the Sci-Fi Air Show, which is a truly remarkable sight. The Sci-Fi Air Show is an online gallery of photographs of practical miniature spaceships digitally blended with actual air show backgrounds. It's a fantasy air show that exists under the premise of what, instead of using sets, models, and special effects, the producers of science fiction films and television shows actually constructed full-size flying spaceships. So my thought was to build a model of the Kellogg Shuttlecraft sketch, using the Polar Lights Galileo Shuttlecraft model as a base, and then scratch building any additional elements I needed. I also decided to base the interior off of the Bill George model as seen in the Sci-Fi Air Show. It won't be perfect, but I hoped it would turn out pretty cool when completed. So to start, I really wanted a carpeted floor. I really like that look in the Bill George model, so after looking around at all the fabric choices available, I settled on a piece of charcoal gray felt. It had the right color and texture, even if that texture was a bit too large in scale, but I thought it looked great. So in order to accurately size it and cut it to shape, I used a sheet of removable vinyl from my Cricut as a template. I placed the vinyl on the floor part of the model and then cut it to shape, leaving just enough of a space all the way around it to allow for the walls and the control console to be glued into place without overlapping any carpet. I then unpeeled the vinyl and placed it onto my felt fabric and cut out that shape. To glue it down, I left the vinyl on the felt and glued that to the floor part of the model. I then started on the interior seating. The chairs were painted gloss black with silver details. They were then attached to the floor. I used a pin vise to sort of drill out holes in the felt. At the same time, I painted the interior walls, ceilings, and other interior parts to match the Bill George model. The interior needed to be completed prior to doing any exterior work because, you know, the interior is on the interior of the exterior. And once the interior is in the interior of the exterior, you can't get to it to paint it or glue it or anything. Sorry, that sounded weird, but that's just how my brain works. Anyway, back to the interior. For the control console, I wanted to give it a wood grain look, again to match the Bill George model. It's been years since I did any sort of faux painting, but I think I got the wood grain pretty nicely. Plus, it looked much better once the decals were in place. The aft engines on the Thomas Kellogg design were pretty significantly different than on the final Galileo model, so I was going to need to scratch build some parts. I cut out the existing engine grills from the kit parts, sanded them smooth, and then scratch built the 3 dividers from sheet styrene. The back engine grill looked to be some sort of corrugated translucent white material. This was achieved by giving the kit's clear part a coat or 2 of frosted glass spray paint. And then I used my Cricut to cut out 1mm strips of a matte clear vinyl. These were laid out on the clear part to give it that corrugated look. At this point, I completed the assembly on the interior and started on the lighting. I wanted to have a center ceiling light, 2 headlights on the lower front, and a nice red glow to the rear engines. The inner ceiling part was cut to the appropriate length, just a bit aft of the side door cutout, and I used half of a small frosted clear plastic container that I picked up at the dollar store. As luck would have it, it was almost exactly the same size as the opening on the interior ceiling part, so I simply glued it into place. I added a bit of metal mesh to the inside of the container to give it some texture. I then stuck 2 small strips of LED tape to a small square of sheet styrene and glued that to the top of the outside of the ceiling. It turned out great and lit up the interior just like I wanted, bright but not too glary. The headlights were done with another small strip of LED tape. I ran the wires under the floor part, which would eventually meet up with all the other wires in a battery and a switch. The engine lights were done in a similar fashion, using a strip of red LED tape, glued to a piece of sheet styrene cut to match the size of the engine grille. This was then glued to the outside of the back of the interior. While the Kellogg Shuttlecraft does have wings on the side, there are no warp nacelles, so the kit part needed to be altered. After gluing the 2 halves of the wings together, I cut off the lower supports that the nacelles attached to. Quite a bit of putty was needed to fill the gaps in the wings, and then they were sanded smooth. 2 lower fins were cut out of sheet styrene and then glued into place to complete the wings. The exterior assembly itself was pretty simple after that. The side walls were glued to the base, the lower aft part was cut to hold a battery and then glued to the bottom base part. The clear parts for the headlights were installed, and the engine was attached to the back panel. Next up was the landing gear. I took the kit parts for the rear landing gear and chopped and cut and rearranged them to create the front landing gear. The 2 rear landing gears were made from scratch using sheet styrene and some 3D printer filament. The exterior was given several coats of gloss black, followed by a clear coat in prep for decals. The landing gear was then glued to the model using a UV cured adhesive. The interior was then placed inside the exterior and glued into place. The 3 sets of wires were joined up and soldered to the battery and switch, which was mounted on the bottom of the model. I'm a big believer in test, and then test again when it comes to lighting a model. But all worked as expected, and the engine lights looked especially great glowing through that frosted plastic grille. The big glass windshield, space shield, canopy, whatever, was created using a sheet of clear acrylic. I first created a template out of sheet styrene and then trimmed it as needed until a good fit was achieved. I then traced that template onto the clear acrylic and cut it out. The clear acrylic was glued into place, and the inner front sides and outer front sides were glued together. A small piece of trim was needed to cover the open front of the control console, and that was added prior to gluing in the clear acrylic. The roof part of the exterior was cut to match the inside ceiling and then glued into place. The lower side door panel was attached to the door opening, and I scratch built some steps in the door panel out of sheet styrene. The two antennae at the front were created using straight pins and sanding off the top ball part, and then they were affixed to the model. This completed the final assembly of the shuttlecraft, and the only thing left was to apply the decals. Prior to starting this build, I had contacted Doug Drexler to see if he had any idea where I could get my hands on the artwork for the decals. I could recreate the large red logo type on the sides, but specifically I was looking for all the little white text elements that appear all over the shuttlecraft. While I could make out most of them, there were a few that I couldn't make out clearly at all. Doug referred me to none other than Bill George, who graciously sent me some Illustrator files of all the text callouts and the red logo type as well. I contacted Matt Weckel at Circus City Decals, whom I found through Facebook, and he printed up the decals. And I will pause here and say, if you need custom decals done for dark surfaces, meaning they're opaque and not transparent, then look no farther than Circus City Decals. They really knocked it out of the park. The decals handled perfectly. Super thin as to completely disappear where clear, and yet strong enough to handle some rough maneuvering on my part when applying them. And with that, the Thomas Kellogg Shuttlecraft was complete. Here are some nice images of the completed model. And that's all the time we have for this episode. Be sure to subscribe to follow along with all of the rest of the builds. And if you're interested in any of my recommended modeling tools and supplies, check out my Amazon store in the description below, featuring some of my favorites. Until next time, I'm Neil Smith of Worksmith 3D. Thanks for watching.